housekeeping, but remember the chat thing on the bottom. If you just kind of scroll down, there's a chat button. If you want to ask questions or comment or tell us what you're eating, that'd be a great place to do that. We have been doing this for, what is this? I think, I don't know, 18 days now, I think, or something. I mean, that's pretty common in my world to drink wine for 18 days in a row, but I bet you guys are starting to feel the effects of it, aren't you? It's hard to go to work in the morning and stuff. I mean, I go to work at 11, so it's not that big a deal. Sometimes 11:05 even. Tara lets me sleep in a little bit. So a little housekeeping first for Fifth and Wine. We did that mac and cheese today, and I don't think anybody ordered, which is very disappointing. I think we have a picture of it, right, Tara? You're on mute.
Yeah, I know, but I need a minute.
Oh, well, all right. Anyway, so we did that today. So you guys probably order a bunch of those tomorrow. We'll run out and stuff. That's how this coronavirus world works. We get like 3 lunches one day and 29 the next. And it's pretty much your guys' fault. So, you know, try to be a little more consistent. Maybe you all could get on a Zoom together before lunch tomorrow and decide who's going to order and who's not, what time you're going to show up and stuff. I mean, that'd be very convenient for us, which I think is kind of the point, right? What else are we going to talk about, Tara? Oh, the beer tasting. So our friend Heather Jackson, who's on here from Eagle Beverage, has lined up 5 breweries. Heather, can you jump on for a second? I know it's Red Lodge and it's Lewis and Clark. Are you there, Heather?
Yep. So we have Kalispell Brewing, Bozone, Red Lodge, Lewis and Clark, and then Kathy pulled some strings and got Elysian, and I think some of the big head honchos with Budweiser are gonna be a part of that too. So should be a really fun week.
So what we're gonna do is sell you, is it 2 each of 3 different kinds of their beers, right? So we'll sell you 2 IPAs and 2 stouts and 2 pale ales. Look at me talking like I know something about beer. Is that right, Heather?
Yeah, so it'll be a 6-pack of mixed styles, and there'll be 2 each.
So you guys are going to get a little break next week. You just have to drink a 6-pack every night instead of a whole bottle of wine. I mean, that's way better, right? If you add up the alcohol in a 6-pack, it's less than a bottle of wine, I'll bet, huh? Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to study a lot this weekend on beer, so I'll have a lot of information for you guys on Tuesday. Probably I'll know the difference for sure between a pale ale and a lager and a pilsner and a stout. And if I don't, we'll just let the brewmasters talk about it, and I'll just kind of have them talk about their dog or something. Anything else, Tara, on the Fifth and Wine side?
Yeah, well, I mean, not really Fifth and Wine, but I was going to show them our food from Embar.
Yeah. So that's right. We did that with the N-Bar, or the block, I guess it's called, today. So Mike Hanahan, I think. Yeah, Mike Hanahan is the chef down there. He does an awesome job. And since we're not doing dinner and we want to support local businesses and especially downtown businesses, because a lot of times people get a drink at the N-Bar and they come down to our place and have dinner or opposite. And so he did a mushroom risotto with stuffed chicken breast and $22, and we picked that up tonight. And we're gonna do that again. We hope tomorrow with them, but anyway, we're thinking about doing it all week with the N-Bar, or the block, just to get them some business too, so we can all get through this together as a community. And so we're gonna work on having somebody every night, and you guys can cook yourselves, but I've seen some of you cook and you're not that good. So maybe you should just, order out. So we should support all these businesses as much as we can, like you guys are supporting us. And so we're going to work on that. And Dave Schulten, you got to tell us where you are on chat, because that's a very busy background. I think that's it before we get started. So tonight we have a guy we've never actually met, or I've never actually met. Van Duzer, the reps have been in our market before, and it's a really interesting story. And Flo is from France originally. So we're going to talk a little bit about his background first and also about where he's from. We just got a nice little chat with him about being from a town that is not famous for wine, and maybe it should be. So maybe we start there, Flo. Is that okay?
Yeah, not a problem. So good morning. I mean, yeah, no, not good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Florent Pierre Merlier. I'm the winemaker for Van Duzer Vineyards. I go with Flo, which is way easier to pronounce. Nothing to do with insurance, so do not ask me anything about special rate. I am not going to be able to help you on that, but I can tell you quite a bit of things about wine. So yeah, like Mark said, so I'm French. I grew up in a town that is called Auxerre. So it's kind of like in the northern Burgundy. It used to be sort of like almost the state capital for Pinot Noir. Back in when Louis XIV was the king of France, and due to the phylloxera invasion, kind of like the wine production on that area sort of like really died off. Most of the vintners back in the day sort of like gave up on producing wine, and then really replaced all those vineyards with filbert orchards, so hazelnut production, and then also some cherry production. It's really changing quite a bit. And I think all that history that used to be in that wine region of the Grand Auxerrois is really kind of like bouncing back. And so, for example, there's a small village within the Grand Auxerrois AVA that is called Irancy. And for example, they are producing a Sauvignon Blanc, and they have the right to call it Sauvignon Blanc de Saint-Brie. And they have the right to put the Burgundy AVA on that. If you try to do that in Pommard, if you try to do that in Volnay or Mercurey, which is kind of like the area that is really a little bit more well known for the Pinot Noir production in Burgundy, they will never have the right to do that, and then they will give up. They will lose kind of like the Burgundy denomination. Same thing. There's also a really interesting.
So Flo, how did you end up?
And I'm just gonna finish with that. There's also a really interesting. So the history of winemaking in that area is really important and really old. For example, the Roman brought grapes 3rd century BC, and so in the area where I grew up, there's like a varietal, for example, that is called César, that is named after Julius Caesar, which was a Roman emperor. And it kind of like really produced some really dark wine with a lot of color and then a lot of structure. And that varietal is still used as a blending component with Pinot Noir. So you were about to ask me why did I end up in the wine world? Is that?
Yeah, kind of like, I mean, I know you grew up in that country, but were you from a wine family? Were you part of the wine world in France too, or you end up in the wine world and kind of your background in enology or vineyard management or anything?
Yeah, so I pretty much ended up in the wine industry really by total mistakes. So the family of my best friend, they own a winery and then a vineyards in that Grand Auxerrois area. And then as a young kid, I just hated the wine industry. Every single time I was staying at his house, I was, if you want to go, for example, to go to the swimming pool or kind of like do something fun, his parents, they were always like, hey guys, I would love to do that, but before you see that palette of wine in the background right here, it needs to be labeled. So we're always like sort of like used and have to do those winery chores as a young kid, and I hated it. I actually study filmmaking in Paris. I work in the film industry in Paris, and I ended up like helping my best friend during one harvest, and totally fell in love with the winemaking, and decided that it was actually the right time for me to kind of like switch career, change path. And then that was the reason why I went to the University of Dijon, and that's really where I got my winemaking background and credential. I worked for a couple years in Burgundy, and then decided to kind of like sharpen my skills to actually work in the wine industry in Switzerland. I work in the Vaud area, which is in between Geneva and Lausanne in Switzerland. And then decided in '09 to move my family back in the Willamette Valley and then start making wine here in the US.
Interesting. I think Dijon is probably the most recognized Pinot Noir school of enology, especially in Chardonnay. So I think you have a great background, obviously, and very well qualified to be there. And so it's fun to talk Pinot Noir with a Burgundian. Which are you between Chablis and Beaune, or where was your village originally?
So the village that I grew up, it's about 15 minutes away from Chablis, about 2 hours south of Paris, and then about an hour north of Dijon.
And then, did you work in Burgundy at a winery too, or a vineyard?
Yeah, so I worked about 2 years in a small winery in Burgundy. Did my education in Dijon, and then, like I said, for me to kind of like really sharpen my skill, it was important to kind of like go into a wine region that is a little bit more challenging, and I think that's really the case with Switzerland. And I think I really learned a lot in Switzerland, because the climate is so finicky that you have to be extremely precise on when to harvest the grapes, just to make sure that you have the perfect balance, and then at the same time be aware of the challenge of the climate.
All right. Sometimes I forget about that mute thing. Tell us how you ended up in Oregon, that story, and then Van Duzer, how you ended up at Van Duzer.
So that's another long story, and I hope that I'm not going to, hijack a little bit too much by telling you.
Turns out we have a lot of time, Flo.
Okay, so perfect. So actually, again, it's because of my best friend. So I had that hate relationship on the early stage of my life with winemaking. Then I helped him in his winery, and then suddenly fell in love with winemaking. And so what was really interesting, and that was kind of like my first interaction with the Willamette Valley, he decided in 1997 to do an internship in a winery in the Willamette Valley that is named King Estates. And to be quite honest, with my French mentality at the time, which was extremely narrow, I think French people are extremely stubborn. They think they know more than anybody else. And I acknowledge that, and I plead guilty, and I apologize.
That's why I'm sitting outside, Flo. Montans are stubborn too.
Okay. And so yeah, he did that internship in 1997 and brought back in France a bunch of wine that we tasted. We had sort of like that wine tasting group every Saturday night, where we went into his cellar, and then opening like some old bottle of wine or odd bottle of wine, having some bread, having some cheeses with it. And that's really where I first have my first interaction with wine from the Willamette Valley. So try some wine from obviously King Estate, since he worked over there. There was some Domaine Drouin, Oregon. There was some Erie Vineyard. There was some Amity wine. And really got intrigued. I was really surprised that he decided as a Burgundian to kind of like do an internship in the Willamette Valley. To be quite honest, I didn't even know where Oregon was. And I didn't know there was a state between Washington and California. But yes, there is one, it's called Oregon. And then Willamette, I had like a really hard time to kind of like pronounce that. But there's kind of like a trick, it's Willamette, damn it. That's really how you learn to kind of like pronounce the name, which is really great for a French guy like me, who massacre English all the time and who have a funny accent. And so yeah, that was kind of like my first interaction. And then later on, I met that girl at his cellar. She was from Oregon. She was actually working at King Estate, and I think that's where the sort of like the connection got in. And we spent about 8 years together in Europe. We studying, a little family, and we decided in '09 that was the right time to kind of like relocate our family in the Willamette Valley, just to make sure that we see both sides of the culture, and then decide that later on they will know that, you know, there's no regret on, oh, we should have done this and we should have done that. I think, you know, when you are in a relationship with two persons with two different culture, I think it's important to kind of like see both sides. And so we ended up in the Willamette Valley in 2009. And then I started working at Duzer in 2010. So in July 2020, I will be celebrating my 10th anniversary at Duzer.
I don't want to belabor this point, but we talked about this earlier with a importer of French and Italian wine. And I went to Burgundy, I think in 2002 for my first time. I've been there a few times since. But the culture in Burgundy and the you could explain that it really is us against the world kind of thing. We understand that a little bit. I think the French culture in general gets, like you said, kind of gets that stigma that they're stubborn and whatever. But Burgundy seems especially that way, in that they think they make the best Pinots in the world and the best Chardonnays in the world, which I would not argue. I think Oregon is right there. But do you think the Burgundian attitude, or the Burgundian, whatever you want to call it, is influenced your winemaking in your career and what's going on with Duzer?
That's a good question. I don't know if I could fully and honestly respond to that. I mean, obviously, the wine that I taste as a young adult or young person, to be quite honest, I think the relationship with alcohol is totally different in France, or especially in Burgundy versus here in the US. And to kind of like give you an example, while I was in elementary school, and I didn't have to try wine, I didn't taste wine when I was in elementary school, but because I grew up in a town and also in a small village before I moved to Auxerre. The historical aspect and relationship between a town and its winemakers, I think it's way more anchored into the culture than it is here in the US. And so we were going and visiting cellars. We were visiting an historical winemaking museum, and we did that during when I was in elementary school. Same thing, you know, during the early toward the end, actually, of the winter, there's the celebration of Saint Vincent, which is the patron of the vintners and then the winemaker in the Catholic religion. And so all of that kind of like really anchored me into that relationship with winemaking. Some of the early wine that I tried, it was really some Chardonnay, some Pinot Noir. And I think I've got that early sort of like interaction and then desire of making Pinot Noir and then Chardonnay. I made some Gamay, I made some Cabernet Sauvignon. We do a little bit of Syrah, for example, at Duzer, but as a Burgundian, my love is all about Pinot Noir and it's all about Chardonnay. And there's actually a say that Burgundian are saying about wine, and it kind of like show you the stubbornness of Burgundian. It's, you know, when you start enjoying wine, you go with Bordeaux wine because they are easy drinking, they're lush, they're big, they have that sweetness. But when your palate gets a little bit more sophisticated, then you start drinking Burgundy wine. And I think it kind of like sort of like give you a good summaries of what is the perception and the stubbornness of being a Burgundian.
Yeah, we had a wine tasting in Missoula a few years back, and Anne Perron, I don't know if you know them, Parent. She's a Burgundian, probably I'll bet in her mid-60s, makes beautiful Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. I was at this tasting, and I said, tasted the first wine. She said, "What do you think?" I said, I think it's really light and easy on the palate. She's like, "Well, you obviously like feminine wines." And then I said something like, "What is your favorite of today?" She's like, "Well, who's your favorite child?" And then I quit asking questions, just let her talk. So, you know, it's like, I think the Burgundians are interesting people, and I love going there. I've been there 4 times, and
Yeah.
the beautiful, beautiful wines, beautiful spot on earth. And that's enough talking about Burgundians. Let's talk about Van Duzer. So tell us what goes on at Van Duzer. Are you in charge of the vineyards, the cellar, and kind of the whole story of Van Duzer winery?
So my title is winemaker. So I am obviously in charge of all the day-to-day winemaking activities. I'm also supervising the vineyards. So I have a vineyards manager that's really in charge of day-to-day vineyards management. But I think a winemaker needs to have that sort of like central or needs to have that understanding of the vineyards and how things are growing, because all of that. So for me as a winemaker, it's really important to go in the vineyards from bud break, which is pretty much where we are right now. We're slightly past bud break, where we now start like seeing some leaves that are really opening up. So we really are at the beginning of the growing season, and I think for me it's really important to kind of like have that interaction to understand what's sort of like the tempo of the vintage, how things are growing. Are they growing? Do we have like an early sign of growth? Do we have a later sign of growth? Do we have quite a bit of water in the soil and all of that? And all those sort of like those little clues, they're gonna give me some way and some understanding on what the vintage is gonna be. So that way, when we start harvesting grapes, and I make the decision on when and what we are bringing in the winery, and at what time, all of that, that's sort of like gonna give me some clue, and that's gonna allow me to be a little bit more precise when it's about time to really transform those grapes, those fruit into a finished wine. Unmute.
All right, fine. Fire me. You told me earlier that you're mostly estate, which means, you know, you grow your own grapes and you're in charge of the vineyards and you have a vineyard manager, but overall, I think that's fairly common. It's more common than it is in Washington, at least. Pretty common in Oregon to have estate fruit and the winemakers in charge of the whole process. Do we lose you, Flo? Oh, no. Song and dance. All right, give it a minute. Take a drink. Everybody relax. All right. Everybody look at Dave's party in La Paz. All right, so we're working on this. We're going to talk about then. Oh yeah, there you go. So since he's gone, Van Duzer is an interesting, when he gets back, we can talk with him about it, but Van Duzer is a corridor. And the Van Duzer corridor is basically a funnel to the coast. So if you go to the Willamette Valley, you have, I remember the mountains, but between the coast and the Willamette Valley, you have a coastal range, and the Van Duzer corridor dips down and allows cold air to come in to the Willamette Valley, and it helps with the diurnal shift he can talk about when he gets back. And so that's what helps them keep grapes from getting too hot or too wet or whatever. So the Van Duzer, and it's just interesting. Heather, you can help me out here on, I think the AVA just became an AVA this last fall. Is that right?
It was in January a year ago.
A year ago. So AVAs, we've talked about AVAs a lot, and they were part of the Eola Amity, I think, or maybe they were probably part of the Willamette Valley AVA, and then they put in a permit or whatever to get back to delineate themselves as a separate AVA, and that happened about a year ago. They have a place to stay that Heather stayed at. And how are we doing on getting our friend back? Anybody? So how I got into wine was, no, I guess I did that one already. He just lost internet at his house. I just got a text on my phone. Wow. All right. I don't know.
This has been really great.
What's that, Heather? Sorry.
I'm going to jump off and call him really quick.
Okay. You guys have a lot to do. Can you hang on for just like 5 minutes or something?
Yeah, my social calendar is really filled up.
So that's fun. I forgot about that. We have Louis and Elizabeth on from Athens,
Georgia.
and we have
78 today.
I don't know if Taylor's on or not for sure, but Taylor Wortman from Bozeman also joined this week, and then I was supposed to have my buddy Paul Anderson from Boston join, but we couldn't get the wine to him in time, so he's gonna do it next week. So. Well, no, I guess not.
Boston's an odd area. My sister lives there. They're like a week behind on deliveries.
I know.
It's strange. Very, very.
Well, anyway, I don't know. We'll give it 5 minutes. Everybody take a break and have a glass of wine, and as soon as he gets back, I'll be back. Sorry,
Where'd Hazel get that red hair?
Hey, I don't know.
I apologize. I lost internet.
Oh, you're back.
There's a voice.
Are you back?
We hear you. I know that's a terrace out because Mark's obviously out on their patio.
Oh, Florent, you're back. I see you at least. There you are. Yeah, I lost you again. Pete's sake. This is some coronavirus ploy to keep us from being even virtually together, I guess.
Let's hope it doesn't happen when we can actually be back together.
Right. Right. Dave Curtis, you look a little uptight. Can you relax? Yeah, there you go. That's better. And maybe Shannon and Toby could get on what they were laughing about so much earlier. It's nice having this gallery view. I probably shouldn't look around while I'm supposed to be interviewing. But, and Ryan and Jeff, you're a little close to the camera. I mean, if Sarah, oh, really? If Sarah was there, that'd be fine.
My kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly. Brom, who else is there with you and Scoot? Oh, there.
I am back.
Nice. Flo.
I apologize for that.
Well, as long as you apologize, that helps. So I did a really horrible job of explaining the Van Duzer corridor.
Okay.
So that was what I tried to do while you were gone. So why don't you tell the real story about the AVA and the actual corridor and how it helps the vineyards and whatever.
Sounds good. So just to kind of like give you a little bit of feedback and information regarding Van Duzer vineyards. So we are fairly old and established vineyards. The first planting at Van Duzer was in 1983. We were the first vineyard in this area and also the first commercial winery to produce some wine in this area. So the Van Duzer corridor, it's a really new approved AVA. It was approved in January 2019. So pretty excited about that. There's about 6 commercial wineries and about 1,000 acres, excuse me, of grapevine planted within that area. And so what is really interesting with the Van Duzer corridor and the Van Duzer corridor AVA, it's really the wind influence that we receive in this area. So site that's got a tendency to be fairly wind driven. And so what is really interesting with that wind is really helping us to be a little bit more sustainable. So from that wind that we receive, so from that heat exchange between the Coast Range and then the Willamette Valley, we really are really decreasing significantly the amount of disease pressure that we get. So way less issue with botrytis or mildew, for example. And then at the same time, we've got a tendency to have a thicker skin, and that thicker skin is really going to translate into wine that's going to have a tendency to have a little bit more color, and then tannin that's going to be a little bit more angular. And so we picked the name Van Duzer Vineyards after the Van Duzer corridor. And the Van Duzer corridor is named after Herbert Van Duzer, who was an engineer who was working for the Oregon Department of Transportation. And then in the late 1800s, he was able to really find a path to go from the ocean all the way up to the Willamette Valley, all the way up to the state capital, which is Salem, without having to do a really big loop and a really big detour, which was about a 300 miles trip. And so to really kind of like pay a tribute to his funding, they kind of like give the name to that path after him. And then because we early on really understood how important the wind was for this area, we decided to kind of like take the name Van Duzer. And also this is why we have Zephyra, which is the goddess of the wind in the Greek mythology. Again, the wind is really something that is really important at Van Duzer.
So what do you guys think? Was that a better explanation than my, like there's a gap in the mountains, right? Boy, there's a lot of head shaking going on, right? So Van Duzer, we were talking about earlier the estate fruit going on, and that you guys grow your own and all of that. So maybe we could start talking about the wine in our glass. Was it 16? Is that right? Yeah, 16 Willamette Valley. It's kind of where the vineyards and whatever you want to talk about with this wine.
So it's kind of like the main Pinot Noir that we are producing at Van Duzer. What I really like, and then one of the luxury that I have at Van Duzer, we have a really significant clonal selection at Van Duzer, and I'm able to use up to 10 different clones of Pinot Noir to really balance the aromatic and make a wine that's got a little bit more complexity. So what I mean by clone, they're all from the Pinot Noir family, but they all have like slight differences. It's pretty much like you guys, you speak English perfectly without any accent. I massacre English once in a while. I speak funny. And I think all those clones have slight differences on how they're going to express themselves. So for example, if you look at Pinot Noir 777, that's going to give you like a lot of aromatic influence, like a lot of red fruit, a lot of floral compounds, but not necessarily a lot of structure. When you pair that with some Pinot Noir 115, for example, the 115 is not going to be necessarily aromatically driven, but it's going to be extremely structurally driven. So really interesting as a winemaker to use all those different clones to bring different nuance into the finished wine. So on that wine, we have like a mix of 777. We've got some Pommard that's going to bring like a little bit more silkiness, a little bit more definition on the mid palate. Some 115 really for the structural effect. Some Pinot Noir 943 that's going to bring like a little bit more like darker fruit, a little bit more like black currant for me. Then we use also some Pinot Noir Valensville that usually bring a little bit more spice and then a little bit more blue fruit. So a little bit almost like that blackberry, blueberry component into the wine.
And then we got some fun things going on in the chat right now. The goddess of the wind was named Zephyra, right?
So the goddess of the west wind, it's actually Zephyr. And we put it an A at the end because we like to kind of like get something that is a little bit more, a name that is a little bit more Americanized, if I can say that this way.
And you guys actually, I think Heather looked into this. You guys actually have an artist that does these labels.
Correct. So, so like I said, the vineyard was established in 1983. It was actually some German immigrant that really started this property. I think there was sort of like a misconception about the site early on. Everybody thought that it was a cool site. So their idea was to really make some sparkling wine out of it. And then the current owners, so Carl and Marilyn Thomas, who live in Chicago, really kind of like took over the vineyards and then really.
Flo, wait. Finally, we have an American involved in this story. Some Chicago people,
Really?
Germans and French.
Exactly. So yeah, Carl and Marilyn Thomas kind of like took over the vineyards and then really kind of like giving sort of like its glory. And then in 1998, they hire Mr. Ramirez, which is a famous artist in the East Coast, to kind of like design the label and then, you know, put Zephyr on that label to kind of like really tell a story and then pay a tribute to that area.
So tell us about this, the vineyards and the oak and the whole thing about this particular wine. And actually the 2016 vintage is interesting too. It was fairly hot, I believe, right? 16?
Yeah, so 16 and sort of like being sort of like being the case since 2014. So 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, they've been really warm vintages. And I think as a winemaker, you almost are on the sort of like the passenger seat, where all you have to do is sort of like kind of like wait and see, pick grapes at the optimum maturity, which was kind of like, to be quite honest, it's kind of like was a shock for me. So my first harvest here in Oregon was in 2009. It sort of like brought me into a position where I had to kind of like sort of like scramble everything I learned about winemaking in Burgundy and sort of like reapproach how to make wine. The reality, and I think that's the big differences between Burgundy and then the Willamette Valley. I think Burgundy, you always have those storms, always have those sort of like weather episode that's sort of like going to challenge your skills. So quite a bit of rainfall about every 2 weeks or so. And I think it's sort of like bring the chemistry a little bit more on the more restrained side. So tendency to have a little bit less sugar accumulation, or a little bit less acid degradation in Burgundy. In the Willamette Valley, it's quite the opposite. And I think really 2016, I like that. So a lot of sugar accumulation, a lot of acid degradation. And I think the challenge as a vineyard manager or as a winemaker who's going to make wine with those fruit is to really sort of like temper the exuberance of the vintage and then really balance the acid. 2016 was really great for that. We have like a really nice balance between really ripe fruit and then also a really ripe phenolics. And by phenolics, I mean color and tannins.
You lived through the 2011 vintage, which must have been a challenge. That's kind of the last vintage in the Willamette that's been cool climate, hard to get the color right, hard to get the tannins, and deciding when to harvest and whatever, right? Can you tell us a little bit about 2011?
So 2011, when I think, and I think most winemakers in the Willamette Valley will reflect the same way. It was a really challenging vintage, but at the same time, it was a really great vintage. I think everybody learned a lot. I think most winemakers who had some experience with Europe were probably a little bit better prepared for this vintage. I think the main challenge of 2011, beside the fact that we were on the cooler side, it was really kind of like the fact that it was extremely late. So on average in the Willamette Valley, we start picking grapes late September, early October. in 2011 in the Willamette Valley. We started picking grapes mid-November to late November. And to be quite honest, I remember walking the vineyards in August, and then the grape was still green. There was no color accumulation. There was barely no acid degradation. And like many winemakers, I really thought that we will not harvest any kind of grapes. We had like a really nice weather during September, and then also really nice weather during October that really kind of like changed the whole dynamic. And then at the end, we were able to produce some wine that for me are really stunning. Not necessarily some wine that were extremely lush and appealing up front. Wine that were a little bit more restrained, but wine, if you can age them, and if you have the proper cellar aging condition, I think those wine are really stunning right now. 16 is quite the opposite. So that a wine that are extremely lush, they were extremely lush up front. Therefore, because we had some fairly cold and cooler weather towards the end of the maturation in 2016, we were able to sort of like push back some acidity into the finished wine and then make a wine that's sort of like the best of both worlds. So kind of like that bright ripeness, that tension and then structure, and then at the same time, that bright acidity that's gonna make a wine that's gonna be mouth-watering. And then also at the same time, a wine that's really gonna have some really good aging capacity.
One of the interesting comments we had today when I was on, well, I didn't really work much today according to Tara, but I thought I did. When I was on the floor, one of the people that came in that's on these wine tastings said, it's amazing to me that we get to meet these people. And we always think when we buy wine that it's some big corporation or it's some, whatever. And it's really fun for the last, 4 weeks now, I guess. We've been doing these wine tastings. And so I don't know how big you guys are, but whatever. You're not Kendall Jackson. So I think kind of just figuring that out, that it's a personal story for you, each vintage to vintage. And the other thing I want to point out, and I'm not saying anything bad about beer people, but if a brewmaster has a bad batch, he can dump it down the drain and start over. I mean, you're probably only going to get to make 35 batches of wine, right? In your wine career, and you don't get to dump it if it's bad. You have to figure out 2011 and 2012 and 16 and 21, right? So I think that's a fun story in the wine world, that you guys only get what you get in fruit inside the winery, and you have to deal with it.
That is correct. And it's kind of like fortunate and unfortunate at the same time. You only get one shot every single year to be able to produce wine. So I think it's a great thing, because I think it's forced us as winemaker to kind of like be extremely precise. It also forced us as winemaker to collaborate with each other, meaning that the wine that I'm making, they're not just influenced by myself. They're not just influenced by what I did in Burgundy. They're also deeply influenced by those winemakers in the Willamette Valley. When I first moved in 2009, and then when I saw the difference between the degree of ripeness here in the Willamette Valley versus the degree of ripeness that I was used to in Burgundy or in Switzerland, it really forced me to really change how I'm approaching wine. And I think it's reflected into the wine. You have to collaborate, and also you have to be precise, because unfortunately you have no margin of error. Or if you have some margin of error, they're extremely slim. So yes, we're a fairly small winery. We produce about 13,000 cases annually. Compared to, for example, the largest producer in the Willamette Valley, which is King Estate or A to Z. It kind of like depend on the year. They produce between 0.5 to 1 million cases. We only produce 13,000 cases. So it kind of like show you that we cannot screw up. If
right.
not, we gone.
So kind of, we've been talking it as a Frenchman. I don't know. I talked to him earlier today, and I said, "Are you a foodie?" And he said, "Well, I'm French." And so we quit with that line of questioning. But let's just say what you would have paired tonight or did pair. I don't know, but tell us kind of about the French food scene in Burgundy and what generally you would think of for Pinot Noir, even Chardonnay too, because I love Chardonnay from Burgundy especially, and Willamette's getting much better at Chardonnay too.
Yeah. So to kind of like say a few words about Chardonnay, I think Willamette Valley was a little bit late in the Chardonnay game, and the reason why it was kind of like the clonal selection that the Willamette Valley was using, 20, 30 years ago. They were using clone from California that were, selected because of that really heat that they get in California, and that is not the case in the Willamette Valley. And I think he was making some wine that totally unbalanced. I think there's kind of like a resurgence with Chardonnay where we are now understanding which clone are working really well, and I think we are making Chardonnay that are way more interesting. And we actually are producing some Chardonnay at Duzer. And in my case, I'm really deeply influenced by Chablis because I grew up nearby. And I'm actually doing no malolactic on my Chardonnay because I want to keep a wine that's going to be slightly a little bit more on the restrained side. I want to also retain the acidity to kind of like make a wine that's really going to have a right length and then also really highlight the minerality on those Chardonnay. And then you asked me something about Pinot Noir, but then I went into a different way, so I totally forgot. So what was your question about Pinot Noir?
Well, first of all, Chardonnay has such a bad rap in America. So you guys have to start trying Chardonnays from Burgundy and from Willamette and unoaked or neutral oak. I think that's really the key, where you get some fruit. Everybody's used to these California Chardonnays that are just covered in oak, and they're not really good food wines, in my opinion, in other people's opinions that are smarter than me. But the question was if you were going to, or did you pair something with a Pinot Noir tonight?
So obviously it really depends on what you're going to have, but I think the Pinots in general go so well with like salmon. So, that would be kind of like, and that's sort of like a specialty of the Willamette Valley. Therefore, I think Pinot Noir can go with so many different dishes. Obviously, cheeses. I don't know if you know your cheeses, but if you don't, and if you have a chance, there's one that is called Epoisses. Epoisses.
And that's from Burgundy, right?
It's from Burgundy. You can tell, I'm not advertising the cheese from my area, but I think they will go so well. There's another one that is called Délices de Bourgogne. That also goes really well. And then I think with dishes, and that is something that is really hard to find here, but that's kind of like a sort of like a specialty from Burgundy. It will be the andouillette, which is kind of like a tripe sausage. So I understand that some people have got like really hard time with tripes. I used to when I was a younger kid, and then when I become a young adult, and then when I discover wine and food pairing, I really totally fell in love with that. So I think it will be something, if you get a chance, if you travel abroad and you get a chance to go to Burgundy, give it a shot, because it is, with Pinot Noir, probably one of the best things you can ever find. And if you don't have a chance to kind of like go abroad, go with salmon. That would go really well.
I was in a country restaurant outside of Beaune in 2002, and I didn't know what I ordered because I just picked something. I don't speak French much or at all. I know bonsoir. But she said the cheek of a pig, and that was seriously. So I think gamey, kind of those really flavorful, earthy dishes bring out a lot in Pinot Noir, right?
Yeah.
Hello?
Absolutely.
So,
I think you should not go with Pinot Noir with something that is too strong. So for example, like pork, I think for me, it's like a little bit too much. Like the meat's gonna probably overwhelm the wine a little bit too much. But if you go with a ribeye or something like that, I think it will go really, really well.
Nice. I think we talked about earlier that you do a lot of other wines, Pinot Gris and single vineyard Pinot Noirs. And I know we carry this Smith and Perry Chardonnay. So maybe talk a little bit about Smith and Perry and what that's about.
Correct. So Smith and Perry, that's kind of like a program that we are carrying at Van Duzer. Really, the idea it's a second label, so it's still under the Van Duzer portfolio. And really, the idea is to kind of like make a wine that's really going to be viticolically driven. It's not going to be overwhelmed by too much oak contents, and then to kind of like have like something that's really going to be fruity, that's really going to be nice and easy drinking, who's got a really bright acidity, and then a wine that's you can enjoy every day. Unlike kind of like the wine, the single vineyards that we are making, and for example, I've got one right here, which are like a little bit more high-end. Those wine are aged in a barrel for a little bit longer, and they're one that's got a little bit more texture, a little bit more structure, and then a little bit more volumes. We also make some Pinot Gris. So Pinot Gris, it's kind of like the white wine in Oregon. I think it's changing quite a bit. Like I said before, there is kind of like that resurgence of the Chardonnay and that really big interest in Chardonnay. And I think for me, one of the white varietal that sort of like the Willamette Valley is missing is probably the Pinot Blanc. We're actually producing a really small quantity of Pinot Blanc at Van Duzer. And for me, Pinot Blanc, it's a white varietal that is a little bit more interesting, a little bit more on the food-friendly side. So something that you're going to pair with a lot of different dishes, Thai food, eventually Mexican food, versus the Pinot Gris. For me, it's more like your go-to wine with seafood. With oyster, for example, or scallops, Pinot Gris goes really well. Pinot Blanc with some cheeses or with some Thai foods goes also really well. And then also another, and I think it's kind of like brought to light that really climate change is really affecting us. There's kind of like, I think there's now, depending on where you are in the Willamette Valley, I think growing some Cabernet Franc or even in some cases Syrah can actually be really interesting in the Willamette Valley.
We just had a microburst of wind and snow come through, so stubborn or not, I had to go inside. Anybody else have anything else for Flo, Laurent tonight? I know. So one of the stories we talked about earlier, we have a winemaker from, an importer, and he said the word Grenache one time. He speaks fluent French, and I didn't even understand the word Grenache because it's Grenache or something, right? Flo, can you say the word Grenache in French?
Grenache.
Grenache, right? There's some kind of. So every time we try to say something and people criticize it, like, you guys have no idea. We don't know how to say all those words, and they don't know how to say all the English words, but. Anyway, so thank you so much, Flo, and it was really fun. And sorry for the little break there, everybody, but I think we learned a lot again tonight, and it's been fun. And anything else, Flo, you want to talk about before we leave?
No, well, thanks for having me. It was really my pleasure. I really hope that you enjoyed the wine, the 2016 Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. Oh, I see that there's an empty bottles over there. Nice job. Cheers, guys. Santé, like we say in French. No, I think that's it. You said something that you are massacring French. Don't worry about that. When I first moved in the Willamette, actually the first time I went in the US in 2002 with my wife to kind of like meet her family, I was like more like speaking like a true Frenchman, which is more like this, and my English was totally horrible. So, you should not apologize for your French. At least you try to pronounce things in French, which is great. So don't feel bad about that.
Nice. Well, thank you so much. And I think tomorrow night is the Albarino, right, Heather? Thumbs up. So tomorrow night we have a Spanish-speaking. He lives in America, though, right, Heather? Thumbs up. I think he still lives in America, or he lives in America like Flo. But I talked to him yesterday, and he has a heavy Spanish accent. So I don't know. We'll work on that tomorrow. And anyway, it's been so fun, and we can't wait to have another night. And we're going to use the N bar again tomorrow, we think, for our, or I guess it's the block for our food pairing. And I think that's about it. So, thank you very much, everybody. And
Thank you for our first time.
yeah, see you, Louis. Elizabeth.
Thanks, guy. If I
Cheers.
can just say one more thing, don't
Sure.
forget to drink Van Duzer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys have a beautiful estate. I've heard. I haven't been, and you have a very welcoming attitude, according to Heather. So if you guys, we talked about this with other winemakers. If you guys head to the Willamette, I'll bet they'll treat us all well. Tell them you're from Montana and you're on the tour, the virtual tour, and they'll treat us right. I'll bet, right, Flo?
Well, for sure, we would love to have you guys over there.
Right. All right. Good night, guys.
Thanks, guys. Good night. Pleasure talking to you.
Cheers.